Hey CMA buddies, let's today start with the 9.1 of Operation Management and Strategic Management. Today we'll be looking at a chapter called as Analysis of Business Environment, right? So before we go on with the chapter, let's understand what exactly is a business environment. Business environment is nothing but it is basically a sum total of all conditions, events and influences in and around an organization that affects it. So when we talk about a business environment, it basically comprises of three things. One is the conditions, second one is events, and third one is influences. So it's basically a sum total of three things: condition, events and influences, which is in and around the organization that has a direct impact on the organization or other which affects it, right? So that's what is business environment all about. Now survival of an organization is dependent on its environment. That is very much true. If an organization needs to thrive or it needs to survive, the basic component that it needs to take into consideration is basically its environment, but it is also a source of threats. So it's both. It's basically a survival instinct that has to be taken into consideration for an organization, but at the same time, it is also a source of threat when we talk about environment of a business. So example of this can be hostile shift in market demands. So what exactly is hostile? Hostile means something which is very unfriendly from the business perspective. So say something which is very unfriendly from the business perspective in terms of market demands, then that becomes a kind of a threat in business environment. Then any new regulatory requirement, so any new requirement that has come into the fray. For example, your GST rates have been increased from say 5% to 18%. So that is again a regulatory requirement. So again that becomes a threat. It can be a vice versa thing also. So if it becomes from 18 to 5, then again it's an opportunity. So that's how you look at the business environment. Then innovation in technology or entry of new competitors. Now innovation in technology, simply we can say that when we talk about AI, artificial intelligence, so when this has come into the picture, then your competition automatically increases, but at the same time it also gives you an opportunity to reach out to the new people and entry of new competitors. The best example can be that of say Asian Paints or say Birla Opus. Fine, Asian Paints was a market leader for a very long time, but Birla Opus coming into the picture recently has proved out to be a big threat for the Asian Paints. So it's a threat for Asian Paints, but at the same time it becomes an opportunity for the Birla Opus. So that's how you look at it. So although survival of an organization is dependent on its environment, but it is also a source of threat. So it can be both. It can be an opportunity as well as a threat. What are the various examples of that? It can be hostile shift in the market demands, new regulatory requirements, innovation in technology or entry of new competitors, right? It is important for the managers to analyze the environment. Very, very important. Because if managers are not able to analyze the environment properly, they will never get to know what are the threats and the opportunities that exist in order to anticipate future and possible influence of the environmental change, right? So that's all about business environment. Now moving further, we do need to understand there is a framework, right? What this framework is all about is framework for analyzing changing and complex environments are organized in a series of layers. So when we talk about changing and complex environments, there is a framework for analyzing the same, and these are basically called as layers, right? Now let's understand what are these different layers. These layers are macro environment. What is macro environment? The bigger picture within which the organization is basically operating. Then industry, the industry in which the particular organization is operating. Then you have the competitors with which the organization needs to compete, or they are the primary threats to the organization because they have the same product, or they are rendering the same services as your businesses. And finally the innermost column talks about the organization. Fine. So when we talk about the framework for analyzing changing and complex environment, it is basically divided into various layers. These layers are macro environment, that is the broader picture, the industry or the sector that the organization belongs to, competitors and the organization. Let's understand these one by one. Let's talk about macro environment. Fine. What do you mean by macro? Macro means something which is bigger. What is the opposite of macro? Macro's opposite is micro. Fine. So when we talk about macro, we are talking about the bigger picture. Now as we all know, the outermost and the highest level layer is the macro environment. So this is the column that we are referring to here, right? Now this basically consists of broad environmental factors that has an impact either greater or lesser extent on almost all organizations, right? So these talks about the broad environmental factors. So that's why it is called as macro. it has an impact. It can be of a greater extent or a lesser extent, but it definitely has an impact on the organization in some way or the other. Now for this, we understand something called as PESTEL framework, or we follow something called as a PESTEL framework. If you have been a foundation student, you would know what exactly PESTEL is. PESTEL is nothing but it is basically an acronym for something called as political, economic, social, technological, environmental and legal, right? So that's the PESTEL framework. So if you talk about the macro environment, the first thing you need to understand in detail is basically the PESTEL framework, right? Now this can be used to identify the future trends which can have significant impact on the organization. So PESTEL can help you know what exactly are the trends or something which is upcoming in the future, which can have a significant impact on the working of the organization. Now what they do is they provide key drivers which may be used to construct scenarios of possible future. So they give you a path, or they give you a guideline to understand what are the various scenarios that can exist in the possible future. These scenarios in turn considers how strategies might need to change. So if you analyze the scenarios that will be coming up, you basically can frame your strategies according to that, depending on the changes in the business environment. So that's the basic idea of having a PESTEL framework. PESTEL is the acronym for political, economical, social, technological, environmental and legal. This is something which we will be discussing in 9.2 in detail. Now what they do is they basically provide you key drivers, right? Key drivers for what? Which may be used to construct possible scenarios of possible future. So what all you basically anticipate, you try to estimate what exactly can be the scenarios. This in turn, how it will help an organization is they can help you to make strategies if any changes there to be executed in the working of the organization, depending on the change in the business environment. So that's how macro environment is so very important, right? Second one is what? Second one is industry, or we can also call it a sector. So here the second one is industry or the sector. Now what does this talk about, or this layer talks about? It is made up of organization producing the same products or services. So when we talk about a sector, we talk about organization that are producing the same products or services. For example, if I talk about FMCG goods, FMCG is what? Fast moving consumer durables, right? Fast moving consumer goods. So if I have to consider, or we have to compare, we can take basically HUL and Dabur, or rather we can say Tata Consumer. They all belong to the same industry or the sector, because more or less you can see that they all produce FMCG products. Even you can say ITC, you can take ITC into consideration. So industry or sector means it comprises of all those, or consists of all those companies or the organization that belongs to the same or rather the organization producing the same products or services. Now when you have to understand the industry or the sector, the concept that you need to analyze is Porter's 5 success framework, right? This is again something which we will be looking in 9.2. So Porter's 5 success framework is useful in understanding the attractiveness of particular industries or sector and potential threats from outside the present set of competitors. So it basically helps you to understand what are the various opportunities and threats in terms of the understanding the attractiveness of particular industries. So how attractive a particular industry is, and what all threats does it carry from the outside the present set of competitors. So it's not only the competitors from which it has the threat, even the threat that they carry from outside the sector, right? Then thirdly, we talk about competitors, right? So first one we saw was macro environment. Macro environment is something wherein we to remember something called as PESTEL, and the second one is industry or sector, where we talk about the Porter's 5 success, or the Porter model that we talk about, that we will be discussing that in detail, Porter's 5 success model. Then we talk about the competitors, right? What exactly is competitor? It is the most immediate layer surrounding an organization. So if you look at this picture, you have the organization over here. So the layer which is immediately next to the organization is the competitor. So the immediate threat or the immediate challenge that an organization needs to face is that will be of a competitor. Now this is the most immediate layer surrounding an organization. Concept of strategic groups can help identify close and more remote competitors. So if the concept of strategic groups, there is something called as strategic groups. Again we'll be discussing that in the upcoming videos. That can help you to identify the close and more remote competitors. So it can help you identify who are the closest competitors and the one who are very remote. Now remote in this case can be if you are working in India, then any company which is outside the country, but they can be a competitor because they are placed in a remote location, but if they come into India or you go outside to do a business of the sector you are working in that case that can prove out to be a competitor. So it both ways, it can be close as well as the remote competitor. So in that ways, you have to have a concept of strategic groups for understanding that. Likewise, in a marketplace, customer expectations are also not the same. That's very obvious. Every customer doesn't have the same expectation. They have different requirements which can be understood through the concepts like market segments and critical success factors. So the two things that you need to remember is market segments and critical success factors. Just remember these points. When we go into detail of this, you'll be able to understand in a better way, right? So the fourth one is obviously organization. We are not discussing that because that's the core around which these layers are working. So first one is the macro environment. Please remember the PESTEL framework. Second one is industry. We talk about the Porter 5 success model, and the third one is competitors. Fine. Okay. Then we come on to the characteristics of a business environment, right? Okay. What are the various characteristics of a business environment? First one is the environment is complex. Yeah. Yes or no? Okay, business environment is very complex as it comprises various factors. Why the business environment is complex? Because it comprises various factors. What are these factors? Such as events, conditions, influences arising from different sources interacting with each other to create a new set of influences, right? That sounds a bit cumbersome. Let's understand with an example. For example, say you have something called as a food production industry, right? Okay. Now, when you talk about a food production industry, then what happens is, in a food production industry, it involves various factors. What can be these various factors? This can be soil, this can be weather, then it can be water, then it can be infrastructure around which the food industry revolves. So these have a significant impact on the food production business. That's what this point is talking about, right? Let's understand, let's read it once again. We would be able to interpret it in a better way. Business environment is very complex as it comprises various factors such as events, conditions and influences arising from different sources. So these can be soil, weather, water and infra when we talk about food production, interacting with each other. Now they have a solid correlation with each other, right? Without one, the other cannot perform, to create a new set of influences. So if they are in tandem or they are in sync with each other, in that case what will happen is business will prosper very well. But even if one of them is lacking somewhere, then that can have a detrimental effect on the performance of a business. So that's what it talks about. So that's why we say the environment is very complex. Now, environment is easier to understand in segments rather than understanding in totality. So if you have to understand the environment, it's better you understand it one by one rather than understanding everything in totality. So that can be a pretty cumbersome process, or then it becomes very complex. So you basically needs to classify it or segment it into different fragments, and then if you try to understand, it becomes way too easier. So you divide it into something like soil, weather, water, infra, rather than taking food production on a whole. So that will make your job more easier, right? Then second one is environment is dynamic. Dynamic means what? Something which is ever changing, which keeps on changing constantly. That is being dynamic. So environment is ever changing. That is very true. Dynamism is largely due to large number of factors that continuously influences environmental character and shape. So dynamism is what? Dynamism is something which is changing forever. There is a constant change when we talk about an environment, right? So dynamism basically largely due to large number of factors that constantly influences or continuously influences environment's character and shape. So two things that are constantly changing the environment are basically it's the character and the shape, right? Third one is environment is multifaceted. Multifaceted means what? Having many sides or different faces. That is multifaceted. Now changes in environment may be perceived differently by different individual. So one person may be looking at an environment in one way, whereas the other person will be looking it at from a different perspective, right? Now this can be simply understand with the way an environment is changing for a say middle class person or say an upper class person. So for example, let's take an example of stock market. Fine. If the stock market is going down, right? In that case, what an upper class would actually do is they will invest more, whereas a middle class will try to sell and because the inflation is very high. That's why the stock markets usually go down. They would try to sell and take the money out. So that's why we say environment is multifaceted. You can take that example in case of a business also. So a change in environment may be perceived differently by different individuals. Now changes and development may be considered to be an opportunity to one and a threat to others. So that's why we are referring to. So what can be an opportunity to one, that is the upper class, will be a threat to the other, that is the middle class. Fine. Then finally you have environment has a far reaching impact. Okay. Now impact of environment on the organization is huge. It underpins the growth and profitability of an organization. Underpins means what? Underpins simply means support. Underpins means support. So when we talk about environment has a far reaching impact, it simply means it basically supports the growth and profitability of an organization. Any changes in the environment affect the organization in more than one way. Survival and existence of an organization is critically dependent on its environment. So the main objective of this point is that it supports the growth and profitability of an organization. If there is a change in the environment, that can have an effect on the organization in many ways. Survival and existence of the organization is keenly or basically dependent on its environment. That is very, very important. So when you talk about characteristics of business environment, 4 things. First of all, it is very complex. Second one is very dynamic. Dynamic means it is ever changing. It is multifaceted because every person perceives it in a different way, and it has a far reaching objective because it supports the growth and the profitability of an organization. Fine. Now with this we move on to 9.2. 9.2, today we will be discussing only the PESTEL framework, right? PESTEL is what? PESTEL is something which we have already looked in macro environment. If you remember, when we talk about macro environment layer, the most important framework is that of a PESTEL framework, right? So let's understand the PESTEL framework in a better way. What is the full form of PESTEL? We have already discussed. One is political, then it is economic, then it is social, then it is technological, then is environmental, and finally it is legal. So this is PESTEL analysis. Please mark it very, very important. A question may be asked from this topic for sure. Okay, let's understand one by one. Political. Now what does a political analysis talks about, or what is the political framework when we talk about the PESTEL? Fine. Okay, first one is political. Political says processes, shapes society's laws, limits the operation of the organization and managers, and create both opportunities and threats. Why? Fine. So when we talk about the political simply means it basically processes, shapes, or rather the political processes shapes society's laws. That's very true. The political party that is in the fray, or someone who's ruling right now, are the ones who will determine the society's laws. They will limits the operations of the organization for the good, or maybe not for the good, but they will have a significant impact on the working of an organization and managers, both organization and managers, and they can create both opportunities and threats. Fine. So a political party may be favorable for one kind of business and may be threat for the other one. So that's how you look at the opportunities and threats when we talk about the political framework. The political instability. What do you mean by political instability? For example, the politics of a country is not stable. That means a government which is ruling may fall anytime. Right, for example, if it's a coalition government and it is standing with the support of many other parties, so even if a couple of parties just pull back their support, in that case the ruling party may fall. So that's what is political instability all about. So political instability can lead to adverse conditions for companies to function. That is obvious, because if a country's politics is not stable, the conditions for the working conditions for the companies may not be very good. So hence they may be very adverse, because they never know what will happen. So if a new party comes into the regime, in automatically all the policies and the framework may change, which may be good or may not be. So hence that may be prove out to be an adverse condition for the company, eventually causing investors to really invested in such regions. Fine. That's very obvious, because if the political condition of a country is very unstable, you will see that investor will not invest in such kind of companies or any companies which belong to that particular region. Political stability can create a lot of business opportunities and considered favorable for business environment. So vice versa, that is absolutely true. So that's what talks about the political processes. Fine. So political processes basically shapes the society's laws. 2 things that you really need to remember is, first of all, political instability, how it can have an adverse effect on the working of an organization in a country, because that will eventually not attract investors. And when we talk about the political stability, then that can create a lot of business opportunities, and it can be considered favorable for the business environment. Fine. The second one is economic, right? This economic force or the economic framework, we call it as macroeconomic forces. Fine. Macro, because when we talk about PESTEL, we talk about the entire picture. So this is not just economic, this is macroeconomic forces. You remember it as PESTEL, but remember E as macroeconomic forces. Fine. That affects the general health and well-being of the nation or the regional economy. Fine. Because it's macroeconomic, it has an overall impact on the health and well-being of the nation and the regional economy. This in turn affects the companies and industries' ability to earn an adequate rate of return. Fine. If your general health and the well-being of a nation or a regional economy is good, that can have a significant impact on the earnings of the company. So that's what the macroeconomics forces talk about. Now, this basically has 4 factors, or the 4 important factors with respect to macroeconomic forces. Fine. Now, what are these 4 macroeconomic forces? When you talk about the macroeconomic forces, 4 important factors when you talk about the macroeconomic forces, I remember that as ICE. Or rather, I can say ICE, ICE. So ICE. Fine. Okay. What is first I? First I talks about interest rates. Okay. Why? Because it determines the demand for a company's product. How? It is important because it has a direct influence on company's cost of capital and its ability to raise funds. What is company's cost of capital? If you look at your chapter in FMDA, that is Financial Management and Business Data Analytics, there is a dedicated chapter on cost of capital. Just to understand it right now, cost of capital is nothing but it is basically the rate at which companies borrows from the external markets. Fine. So if I go to a bank, I borrow a loan. In that case, the rate at which it is being lent to me, that will be called as a cost of capital. That's what this interest rate is all about. So it is important because it has a direct influence on the company's cost of capital. That's very obvious. If the higher rate of interest is prevailing, that the company will borrow low. Fine. So that eventually will affect on the growth of the company, and vice versa is also true. So it is important because it has a direct influence on company's cost of capital and its ability to raise funds and invest in new assets. Lower the interest rates, lower the cost of capital, and more investment opportunities. That's what I refer to. Fine. So that's what is interest rate all about. Okay. Second I is what? Second I is inflation or deflation rates. So I just to simplify, I have retained or remembered that as inflation, but it comprises of both inflation as well as the deflation. Now, if inflation keeps on rising, the inflation is what cost of goods and services keeps on rising, investment will become difficult. That's very obvious, because if it is expensive, then why would someone invest more? So inflation can make future less predictable. Deflation, on the other hand, has a destabilizing effect on economic activity. What do you mean by deflation? Deflation is nothing but it is fall in the general price of level of goods and services, or rather it is the inverse of inflation. Now, when the inflation is below 0%, it reduces the value of the currency. So if there is a deflation, it can have a significant impact or an adverse impact on the value of the currency of the country. If the prices fall, prices of fixed payments go up. Yes or no? Fixed payments being bought, for example, an organization is working and they have rented their building. See, immaterial of the fact whether the prices go up or down, the rent has to be paid, and that is very constant. Fine, more or less it's a fixed payment. So if the prices fall, that means there is a deflation, and the prices of the goods or services comes down, then the prices of fixed payments will actually go up. Yes or no? The price will remain constant. If you are incurring loss or you're not making much revenue, then the same price will be an expenditure for you, or higher expenditure for you. So that's what it is referring to. This is damaging for companies and individuals with a high level of debt. So someone having a high level of debt, that can have a significant impact on them. So two things is, one is interest rate, second one is inflation or deflation rates. Then we talk about C. C is what? Currency or exchange rates. Currency or exchange rates is what? Define the comparative value of different currencies. Comparison of, say, rupee with a dollar. Right. So if the dollar is strengthening, that means the rupee will weaken, and vice versa. Movement of the same has a direct impact on the competitiveness of a company's product. So this can have a direct impact on the competitiveness of a company's product, or rather it can have a significant impact if they are exporting or importing on the prices of the commodities. Fine. Then finally you talk about the growth rate of the economy, that is E. Fine. So that's what I have referred to in ICE, that is growth rate of the economy. Growth eases competitive pressure within an industry as it leads to increase in customer expenditure. If the customer expenditure goes up, then the business volume also goes up, and eventually that has a significant raise in your revenues as well as the profits. This in turn helps to expand companies' operations and earn higher profits. That's what I'm talking about. In case of economic decline, or what we call as a recession, that means there is no growth, there's a decline. In that case, it increases competitive pressure, leading to a reduction in customer expenditure. So it's absolutely vice versa of what we spoke right now. So how do you remember macroeconomic forces? Macroeconomic forces, you need to remember four important factors, what I call as ICE. I stands for inflation or deflation rates, and the remaining three stands for interest rates, C for currency exchange rate, and finally we talk about the growth rate of the economy. Right? And then we come to PESTEL's S. Okay, what is S? S is nothing but it is a social influence. Social influence talks about what? It includes changing cultures and demographics. So any change in the culture or the demography of a country, in that case PESTEL's S is taken into account. Fine. Demography means what? Demography depends on the changes in characteristics of a population such as age, gender, ethnicity, race, sexual orientation, and social class. So these are the various factors when we talk about demography. So a demography basically depends on all these characteristics, that is age, gender, ethnicity, ethnicity they belong to, the race they belong to, what is their sexual orientation, and the social class. This provides an opportunity and threats and can have major implications of the organization. Fine. So they can be an opportunity also. For example, if you are selling something which is for a younger generation, right, and you have a lot of youth population in the country, so that can be a opportunity. But if the same thing is there, for example, you're selling something which is for the younger generation, but the population is very old. For example, in case of Japan, right, Japan, you can see there's a lot of aging population. But if you have something which is more in trend, for example, you're selling latest cars or automobiles, right? Now, latest cars and automobiles or mobile phones for that matter will be bought by whom? It will be bought basically by the youth. But if the population is aging, then the same opportunity can become a threat in that particular circumstances or situation, right? And this can have major implications for the organization. So that's what is a social influences talks about. Then we talk about T, that is technological T, that is the PESTEL's acronym T. It talks about, refers to innovations. What can be different innovations that can have an impact on the business? It can be such as AI, that is artificial intelligence, internet, nanotechnology, or the rise of new composite materials. Right? Self-explanatory. I'm not going into detail. Then we talk about the environmental. Okay, what does environmental talks about? It refers to green issues such as pollution and waste. Fine. Nowadays, every country is trying to, because of the climate change, they are trying to reduce the pollution level, right? So these are basically referred to as green issues, and they consist of topics like pollution and waste. They are of great significance. Why? Because since the globe is increasingly concerned with the environmental changes and striving towards clean, green, and renewable sources of energy. So this can be an opportunity because that can reduce the pollution from the macroeconomics perspective. But if you look at from a company's perspective, that can be pretty costly affair. So that can be again detrimental for the growth of a company. So it's basically how you look at it. Then disposal of e-waste and global warming are also important causes of concern. So when we talk about environmental factors, e-waste and global warming should also be taken into consideration. And finally, we talk about something called as legal. Fine. That is L of PESTEL. It is considers legal legislative constraints or changes. So if there is any change in the law or the rule, in that case, even legal has a lot of impact on the PESTEL, on the company's operations, and this can be such as health and safety legislation or restriction on companies' mergers and acquisitions. So that's what is PESTEL all about, right? Quickly just running through, PESTEL is what? PESTEL is nothing but it is one of the macroeconomic framework through which we can understand the broad environmental factors. Now this PESTEL framework full form is what? It is political, macroeconomic, or other economic, social influences, technological, and environmental, and legal. When we talk about political, it talks about the political stability and instability, which I have explained in detail. Then we talk about the economic forces. It basically comprises of 4 important factors. Remember it as ICE. I is basically interest rates, and the remaining I stands for inflation or the deflation rates, currency or exchange rates, and finally the growth rate of the economy. Then social influences, which talks about the demography, then the technological, environmental, that is e-waste or the green issues that we talk about. And finally the legal is something which considers the legislative constraints or the changes, and this has such as health and safety legislation with respect to or restrictions on the company's mergers and acquisition. Identifying key drivers for change helps managers to focus on PESTEL factors that are most important and which must be addressed as the highest priority. So PESTEL has a lot of relevance when we talk about a company's operations, right? In the next video, we'll be looking at value chain and the POTUS 5 POTUS 5 framework, and with that we'll be finishing the chapter. I hope you like this video, so please consider subscribing the channel, liking it and sharing with your friends. So keep learning and just enjoy yourself, and all the best.